we'll kick it off. Welcome to a Lunch and Learn with Terry Bean and Jay Johnson. We are here to talk a little bit about behavioral elements, how it shows up, what drives behavior, and really what gets us going. So, Terry, why don't you go ahead and take a minute and introduce yourself for those that may not know you particularly well?
Sure. My name's Terry Bean. I've been in the Detroit area for the last 23 years. I've had the opportunity to do some really interesting stuff here. Started a business networking organization called Motor City Connect back in 2005. Ran that up until the pandemic, literally the day after the pandemic. And the goal was to connect people, to help them grow themselves, grow their business, and grow our community. One of the biggest offshoots of that organization became TEDx Detroit. I've been an executive producer of that fantastic event since 2009, which was literally minute one of its existence. So that's been a ton of fun. In my work time, I coach, I train, and I do keynote presentations all around the ideas of business and professional growth. I had the good fortune of meeting this fine gentleman, Jay Johnson, earlier this year while chatting with a mutual friend of ours about an idea I had about what if we could replace the disc assessment with something that was easier to recognize and we leverage the four elements to do it. I told him I've been thinking about this for about a year and a half and had a bunch of ideas jotted down on how to get that kicked off and started. And he said, "Oh, you must follow Jay Johnson." I said, "Who's Jay Johnson?" He said, "Well, he's a guy that's doing coaching and training and speaking and has an assessment built with a company called Behavioral Elements. He's doing exactly what you just said." I said, "Say no more." And I found Jay. We had coffee, and then started our little bromance. So it's been a few months, 8 months or so. Got certified last month, and I'm super excited to be here. Well, 2 months ago, whatever. It's October.
Well, and it's so funny because as soon as we connected and you kind of shared that story, in my brain, I'm like, awesome. Great minds think alike. We're going to get along famously. And sure enough, here we are today. So I'm Jay Johnson. I'm one of the co founders of Behavioral Elements and the CEO of Coius Creative Group, where we try to help people and organizations behave intelligently. So excited for everybody to be here today. I want to start real quick with just launching a poll, and I want to find out what are some of the biggest challenges that you're facing at work? What are those things? And you'll see a number of different things. If you want to select any of those that really kind of resonate with you, whether that's difficult people, motivation, engagement, productivity, teams, culture, leadership, decision making, sales, operations, hiring. I know there's a lot of options there, but it'll be really interesting to kind of see what everybody's experiencing and what some of those things are that maybe we can focus some of our energy and talk about here today. So check out that poll. It should have launched. Looks like we're getting some responses come. Wow, lots of difficult people, lots of motivation and engagement, some productivity. All right, looking good. So awesome. When we're thinking about behavioral elements, and really what behavioral elements is all about is really helping us to understand where our behavior comes from. And as Terry had mentioned, we just finished the TEDx. He just finished the TEDx Detroit running that. And Terry was actually my coach, my TEDx coach. So if you are interested in ever doing a TEDx coach, I do highly, highly encourage you to connect with Terry. Absolutely phenomenal. Help me craft the message, help me encourage me, inspire me to put in there. But one of the things and one of the main messages are when we become aware of our behaviors, that's really where the magic happens. And we start to be able to navigate our decisions, how we make those decisions each and every day. So, Terry, in terms of behavioral elements, what was something that maybe stood out to you when you went through the certification or when you took the assessment? What was something that really kind of jumped out at you?
It's kind of simple, but it's not something that we think about all the time. And it's almost like a tagline for y'all. It's behavior is a choice, right? We get to choose who we're being in every single interaction. And I think one of the most valuable things of the whole behavioral elements process is understanding what's driving our behaviors so we can make more informed choices. And I love that piece of it because it brings us pause. Well, hopefully it brings us pause. The old saying is 90% of life, 10% of life is what happens, and 90% is how we respond to it. My challenge for the longest time is most people don't respond, they react. And I think understanding what our behaviors are and how they show up gives us a much better opportunity to respond. So those things really, really matter to me. And then being able to share that and elucidate that for others is why I was all in. I'm giving here's all my chips. I'm in.
I love it. When we were talking earlier before we actually officially started, one of the things that we were talking about, you kind of brought that up of if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go with the team. And I shared with you, but back a long time ago, I am definitely somebody that loves to go fast. So for those that know, I am a fire element. For those that don't know, we'll talk a little bit about what that means. So I like to make decisions quickly. I like to get moving. I want action, results, etc. And so often I tried to merge those two things together of going fast and going with the team. And I'd run my sprint and turn around and look around and be like, where's my team? I'd end up leaving them behind. But, through behavioral elements and understanding that sort of drive, it really helped me nurture that drive to bond, that water element in that equation to say, hey, let's build an actual culture where everybody's going to thrive and survive.
It's so important, right? And I think as I'm looking at the results from the poll here, when you look at difficult people in conflict is probably number two on this list. And one of the things that I think is a challenge for most people is not taking the time to understand where other people are coming from. And when we have this framework of knowledge, it almost gives us instant access to understanding where they're coming from. And to your point, we'll dive into that a little bit deeper. And I'm excited about that conversation for sure. This motivation and engagement being the number one answer from 38% of you is something we'll definitely tackle as well.
Yeah, and to that point, Terry, when we start thinking about motivation and the things that really sort of like drive us, that is a huge piece that ultimately we can learn from the behavioral elements. So just to give everybody sort of that foundational framework, the elements are mapped to the four core biological drives. And that drive framework was put together by Dr. Paul Lawrence and Dr. Nitin Noria out of Harvard University. So, just as a little bit of background, they say there's four drives: the drive to acquire, which is we need to gather resources, we want to win, get results; the drive to bond, which is our water element. So, acquire is fire, water element, the drive to bond, really associated with connection, building teams, really people focused. The drive to learn, which is our air element, and that need for curiosity, the satisfying of new knowledge and new experiences. And then lastly, our drive to defend, the earth element, which is really about creating systems and processes that we can create certainty and predictability. So reducing risk, improving quality, et cetera, that's really associated with our earth element. Now, all humans have all four of them. It's really how we lean into those in different ways. So, what is maybe one of the things that you would talk about in terms of your elements, Terry? If you were to diagnose yourself, what would you say? And let me know if you want me to share, in advance here.
I think we'll get to the actual imagery in a minute or so, but I will tell you that, as Jay said, we have all four, and Earth is exceedingly low for me, especially relative to the other three. And so what I learned is, we talk about the idea that you could play to your strengths, right? And you should either work on your weaknesses or cover your weaknesses. I was about 25 years old. I was in my second professional job as a technical recruiter down in Columbus, Ohio. And I remember writing on my whiteboard three simple words: cover your weaknesses. I didn't want to work on my weaknesses. weaknesses. I wanted to work on my strengths. I wanted to be in my area of things that I'm really good at. It didn't make sense for me to waste time and energy and effort on getting better at things. Like if I could move the needle from a D to a C, that didn't seem to have as much impact as moving the needle from a B to an A. And so my earth being low, structure, systems, processes, the things that Jay mentioned earlier were not going to be areas of strength for me. So finding people that were really process oriented. My wife is a great example. She starts a task, she gets it done, she moves on to the next one. I start a task, I work on it for 7 minutes. I start a different task. I work on it for 8 minutes. I'll start another task. And, eventually a week later, they'll all be done. But I couldn't do something sitting still aside from this. I can flap my gums for hours on it.
Terry, I
But
feel seen. I feel seen right now.
it's a thing, man. So finding people to partner with that are really good at the things that you're not as good at becomes an important element of what this tool and assessment can help you with. And I saw someone ask about what is this assessment and the certification we keep referring to. So maybe now is a good time to jump into that, Jay. And I know I'm tangential, but that's part of my charm. At least I tell myself that.
I'm throwing the behavioral elements link in the chat. You can actually go to the website, take the assessment for free. It'll tell you what your primary element is. I did want to dig into something though here, Terry, because you are one of our anomalies when you took the assessment, and we'll get into that in a moment. But your earth element, as you mentioned, is low. When we look at that low element, I look at this and I go, but wait a second, you've published books, you've organized conferences, you've done things that are detail oriented. And I think this is a great space to bring up whatever your assessment is and whatever your levels are. Just because something's low doesn't mean that you're bad at it. It really means that it takes more intentionality, energy, effort to do. So when we look at something like motivation or engagement as one of the kind of key things that people are experiencing, one of the ways that we look at this, and I just did an entire session yesterday with a health agency on burnout. And I looked at it and I said, generally, burnout is going to be something that you're either overdoing it on one of the drives or under fulfilling one of the other drives. And that's been pretty consistent in all the work. We've done work with about 5,000 healthcare professionals. And usually we can say, okay, you're over leaning into your drive to bond, or you're under leaning into that drive to defend, or you're under leaning into that drive to learn. You're not taking care of those types of things to fill each of the buckets. So with you being a low earth, but yet still being able to do really good things, I mean, you can't write a book without having some level of system or process. How did you maybe overcome some of that challenge when you got into that place? Obviously, you bring in other people, but is there anything else that really kind of motivated you to dig into that?
Book one, I stood in front of a group of people in December and I told them that this book will be done by March. And so what I wasn't really clear about was that December meeting was December 2008 and the book release was March 2010. So I wasn't overly specific about the things. And I got it done in one little baby section at a time. I didn't put a real timeline on it for myself. And I knew that if it was going to be worth doing, it was going to be done when I felt like doing it. And to sit down and force myself to crank it out wasn't going to work. Book two, the writing portion was really easy. But the graphics, the design, the activities that I wanted to include, I found myself a very strong earth partner. I gave her chunk of the a chunk of the revenue that came from the sale of the book and asked her if she wanted to partner on it. She said, "Heck yeah, I love what you're doing." So she dove in feet first, head first, body first, all the first. and we knocked it out together. That book took from the time I wrote word one to the time that she was polishing the final draft was about 48 days. So
Wow.
it's amazing how much different it is when you get the right people involved.
Absolutely. I want to comment on a few things in the chat that I'm seeing here. Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. I love that. It is harrowing to listen to the first 3 hours, but yes, yeah, our choice of responding to those stimuli are so important. And it's the one thing in this world that we actually have. I can't control other people. I can't control somebody else's behavior. But why would I let somebody else's behavior give me a heart attack, right? And that's one of the big messages with dealing with difficult people is I can control my reaction and my response or how I want to show up. In many of those cases, we feel almost like a victim, like we're a victim of those difficult people. But to blame something is to empower it. Don't blame a difficult person for the emotional reactions that you have. You are a champion. You can own that space and make the requisite choices that are going to help you navigate those situations. And I love it, Kathy. Terry, I see why you and Jay get along so well. Yes, absolutely. So, and I wanted to bring that up because a lot of times when people look at an assessment and they say, oh my gosh, the Earth is so low, that must be a huge weakness. In the behavioral elements, one of the things that we really try to say is like, for example, my Earth is also very low, Terry. Um, I'm a research scientist. I do methodological studies. I do search engine optimization. There's a reason why behavioral intelligence is number one for Cohea's creative group on a Google search. And that's very tedious, detailed oriented work. What I find is when I'm doing something like talking, training, teaching, my energy levels go up. I could do that all day. Yesterday, I had a 6 hour session following a 3 hour session the night before, a 3 hour drive in between, about 6 hours of sleep, and I had energy all day. When I'm doing earth related tasks, some of those processor systems focused tasks, that's where it's like I do an hour and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm depleted. And it was really through this that helped me to kind of understand a lot of think of each element as a bucket. You got your largest element, that's going to be your biggest bucket. You're going to spend a majority of your energy and time in that space, and it's going to feel really comfortable. Your lower elements oftentimes are a smaller bucket. You don't need to put as much water in it to feel fulfilled, but that doesn't mean you can completely neglect and ignore it. And Kathy, who is on here, recognizes that I neglected and ignored some earth element tasks in the early stages of my business. And Kathy is a CPA with LMR who helped me get out of some of the challenges that come with ignoring earth related tasks. So, yes, 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 yes.
That's awesome. Peter, I want to get to your question in just a second. And before I do, I want to ask this question of Jay. I'd love to hear where this came from for you, right? How did you assimilate this information and put it together? Before we get to that, though, Peter, you've got the hand raised. I don't know if we're bringing people on, or maybe Peter could put the question in the chat, or possibly Peter just hit the hand raise button and didn't even mean to. All of those things are possible.
So we do have Q&A wide open. We encourage you ask questions, jump in there. What are some things that you really want to know? If there's a specific area, you can use that Q&A. Also, we do have the chat we're monitoring here, so we want to make sure this is really engaging and interactive for you. But one of the things what brought me to this, research is often me search, and ultimately over the last 20 years, I have always been on the search. I started in communications, interpersonal communications, relationships. That was sort of my foreground, and then found my way into psychological studies and started to be like, wow, this opened up new ideas, new areas for me to understand myself. And I always felt that there was still something missing. And then all of a sudden, neuroscience, starts blowing up, and we start getting great data points and interesting information from there. So that's kind of the three-legged foundation. And at some point in time, I had happened across Dr. Paul Lawrence and Dr. Nitin Noria's book. And in that book, Driven, which is the foundation of the behavioral elements, the science behind behavioral elements, at the end of it, Dr. Lawrence and Dr. Noria says at some point in time, somebody's going to come along and figure out how to map and measure these drives. And my fire and my air element, which is my secondary, was like, you darn right I am. And for the next 2 years, tried to figure out how to develop a methodology to be able to sensitively measure, what are these things that are pushing and pulling each of my own personal behaviors. When we figured that out, that was when it was like, and tested it, and people were like, oh my gosh, this helps me explain so much more than just like, here's your personality, it's static, it's unchanging, except for when you behave outside of character, or when you feel a cognitive dissonance between, I really want that piece of chocolate cake and I don't want that piece of chocolate cake. Well, what accounts for that sort of push and pull? And that's where the elements come in. And it just helped me really understand, okay, I'm driven to acquire, I'm driven to succeed, I have that fire element. But what about those moments and times when I do feel really strongly like, okay, we need a system or a process in play for me to feel like this is going to be repeatable? And as an entrepreneur, you have to have repeatable processes. Otherwise, your capacity for growth or your capacity for stability is out the window. So, learning to be able to navigate the back and forth of those drives is really what sort of brought this into being for me.
Ooh, love that. How'd you come across the book Driven?
I guess because my air element is my second, I am always on the prowl for learning. I really enjoy, every day I'm listening to podcasts, I'm doing reading, I use Audible. I'm frequently asked for like book recommendations on the area and the space. And in return, I say, yeah, I'm happy to give you some, but I also want some in return. And usually that kind of inspires me to say, okay, what's going next into the wish list, which is probably like 132 long on Audible. And I just kind of go through each of those. So with travel, it makes it super easy. Driven was one that was recommended, and I took a look at it and I was like, this is it. This is helping me understand myself. And everything there came afterwards.
Love it. I love it. We're going to shift gears to an audience question.
All right.
Taylor asks, do you have data to show self improvement? And if there are any fluctuations between the elements depending on stages of life or situations people are in?
I love that question, Taylor.
Thank
And
you.
actually, it was so we have the certification program. We got a number of certified guides, and yesterday it was one of our certified guides. Her name is Nihal, and she's from Turkey. Talked about, when we did the assessment. This was 3 years ago. We implemented it in her organization and found out that only the CEO was the only fire, and she's a partner in this place, and really wanted to elevate, some of her fire behaviors. Making more decisive actions and really kind of targeting results and going through it. She was really high air. Over the course of that year, she actually utilized the fire elements planner and started to map out her behaviors. And when she would get to some of those different behaviors, she'd look back on them and say, okay, this is where I need to be more decisive. This is where I need to pull back on that just a little bit. We reassessed her a year later, and sure enough, her fire had moved up and her air had kind of balanced out a little bit. She just also finished a year working in a highly collaborative, highly driven to bond team, and we've seen fluctuations. So, how do we explain this? Well, the brain actually has neuroplasticity. I like to make the joke of, you probably brush your teeth with one particular hand, and if you switched hands, you'd probably stab yourself into gums for at least the first 2 weeks, and it would be uncomfortable. But after a short amount of time, new synapses start to fire, new processes start to work. And it's the same thing with our behavior. We normalize and become comfortable with certain behaviors. This is a way to understand where those behaviors are coming from. And am I ever going to change myself from a fire to an earth? Probably not. That's probably not going to happen. But through practice and through engagement and through awareness, I can choose the behaviors that are going to help level me out. I can become more comfortable with earth behaviors. So that's some of the ways in which we measure, is like, where do we go from our choices, from our decisions? How do we track those and measure those out? Are they bringing us the success that we want? Terry, any concept, any additional comments you want to make on that question? You got to hear Nihal's story yesterday.
I did, and it was really, really cool to hear her share that, and then the idea of saying, "Now after doing this water thing, I gotta amp up my air again," and the fact that she already had a strategy and a plan for how to do that was really awesome, and she was like, "This is what I'm gonna do," and we ended up utilizing a new tool, a behavior tracker that is gonna enable her to do that as well, adding to a system and or a process, which I said scares and excites me simultaneously because, system and process. A quick story because you brought it up. During COVID, we were also bored that many people ended up watching Tiger King.
Yeah.
I couldn't do that. But what I did do was learn how to brush my teeth with the opposite hand. I also learned how to do some other things with the opposite hand. That it was an interesting practice. I did stab myself in the gums more than once, and but by the end of that first week, I was like, all right, well, if I'm ever in a cast on my right hand, lefty can take over. I got this, and it was an interesting exercise. So I'm going to encourage some of you, because only a few of you are going to do this, but tomorrow or tonight when you brush your teeth next, switch hands. Let us know how it goes. I really can't wait to hear about that.
I do see Brian's comment in the chat. I tried switching hands once and it was surprisingly hard. Absolutely. And that's the thing is like simple things, we really can shift our behaviors. Here's a great example of trying to shift maybe to more of a drive to learn. Most of us have a particular routine when we say travel to or from the office. You probably go down the same roads, you probably pass the same coffee shops, etc. And at least in Michigan, you have a lot of options. You choose this road, and maybe that's the most efficient or the most operative or anything else. If you want to start developing a learning function, that drive to learn new experiences, challenge yourself over the next week to take a different route into work every single day. And I will tell you, you're going to notice different things. You're going to become aware of different things. All of those things are going to spark different synapses and it's going to produce acetylcholine in your brain. You're going to learn that GABA is going to start coming out. And then all of a sudden, you're going to be like, maybe you find a new restaurant. Maybe you find a new pathway that's more efficient. Maybe you find ways not to go to work ever again because of Michigan has two seasons, winter and construction. So those are the types of things that can actually yeah, somebody just Kathy, there it is, right? So but when you think about like changing and shifting behaviors, it does take a little time, it takes a little practice, but we are more than capable of creating these new synapses. That's one of the big things that makes this different than, say, like a personality assessment. Most psychological literature says your personality is pretty well cemented by the age of 6 years old. But with the behavioral elements, it's really about growth. What do I want to do? What do I want to achieve? How do I want to be? I'm not. One of my challenges with personality assessments is, oh well, that's just how I am, and it's like, no, that's how you're choosing to be. It takes work to choose to be different or to behave differently, but that's really what Behave Intelligently is all about. So
That is an excellent segue to the next question. Madison asks, is there any correlation with the behavioral elements and other personality tests such as the Enneagram, Myers-Briggs, love languages, etc.?
I love it. So, and I'll answer this question just strictly from the methodological standpoint. When we developed this, one of the first test cases that we did was so I'm certified in DISC, Myers-Briggs, the Neo-PIR, the Rorschach, you pretty much name it. I can assess a personality. And our initial pilot, some of the things that we did was we put them through behavioral elements, we put them through these other personality assessments. And afterwards, we tried to map and say, hey, could we predict the element outcomes based on personality? And the most exciting day of my behavioral elements life was when the answer to that was no. That you could be an extroverted fire, you can be an introverted fire. You can be an open air, you could be a agreeable earth, you can be a high D in one and ultimately be very much driven to defend. So this is something that's added value on top of understanding your personality. It's not something that replaces it because personality does have an impact on behavior, but there was no causal relationship or predictability models that we could say, Terry, I know that you're an ESTP, and that's going to mean you're going to be this in this assessment. So we actually even did interviews like accuracy, validity scales, and those types of things. And that was super excited. Yeah, I saw Revna jump in there behind me, so she wanted to make an appearance on today's webinar. So yeah, great question. And ultimately, our personality is really a product of, that nurturing and sort of the development of our personality. These are really mapping to neurotransmitters. The drive to acquire is very much associated with dopamine and a dopaminergic drive. The drive to defend earth elements very much associated with cortisol, adrenaline, norepinephrine, et cetera. So this is a little bit different science that is being explored with the behavioral elements.
Love it.
I'm
Absolutely.
loving these questions and comments. So Chrissy, that's a great question about ADHD, OCD, et cetera. We don't have enough data on those types of things yet. This was actually asked of me yesterday, like how do different neurodivergence or neurodiversities, how is that impacted in this space? We don't have enough quantifiable data to actually give a research or a methodological answer to that. One thing that we do know is that in most of those different neurodivergent whether it's ADHD, whether it's OCD or anything else, it is a function of different neurotransmitters, either dopamine being too high or dopamine being too low, or oxytocin being exceptionally high or low. So I'm sure that there's some kind of correlation, but I wouldn't be able to speak to that just yet until I actually have good, solid science behind what I would say. So great question. That is something that's on the docket for us to explore as we go forward.
I'm making a note of that because I have some interesting inroads to be able to find a nice sample size for that.
Awesome. That would be fantastic. I would love to see what the data comes back on it. So, and that's something that whenever you get into some kind of clinical issues and everything else like that, we would obviously want to go through the things like IRB and make sure that it's all very, very the behavioral elements doesn't have any medical data behind it, even though that it is mapping our drives or sort of our preferences. There's no medical data behind it. But if we were to actually encourage something like that, that would take a different level of research that we just haven't necessarily started to go down that road. Now, we do have a couple of BE certified guides that are actual cognitive behavioral therapists and that are people that are in those clinical areas that do have an interest in that. So stay tuned. Hopefully, I'll have a better answer for you, and with Terry's help, maybe sooner than later. So that'd be great.
Love it, love it, love it. Let's pop open the actual results of our assessments, walk through that a little bit, and share that part of the conversation. So this is I don't know, page four-ish of the 27-page results you get in the pro assessment. As Jay mentioned earlier, the free assessment is going to show you your primary driver. You're going to get a 3-page response. It's going to tell you a little bit about that drive, and it's going to tell you a little bit about the 3 other drives, and that's kind of it. The pro assessment goes into a very specific quantification of how each of the elements show up in your world, then goes into a great description as to each of them, and then gives you tips for leadership, for communicating, for selling, for a couple of other areas of business and personal life as well. So there's a major difference between the free version and the pro version, and frankly, of course, there should be. So Jay is on the left, and I haven't heard anybody call him Jeremy yet. To be fair, I haven't met his mom. And then that's mine on the right. Does anybody call you Jeremy?
No, not even my mother. So yeah, no, but yeah, that was my official crack at it there. So I had mentioned earlier, Terry, that you are one of our anomalies. Up until Terry had taken the assessment, I could accurately say, hey, across 30,000 assessments, no one has ever had a 0.25 in any of the elements. And sure enough, that popped up. And I know that you had kind of spoken to that, where it's, that would be one of our lowest areas. And you and I have had some really, really great discussions about that because I'm like, yeah, but you do these things and you do them really, really well. Let's go back to that sort of motivation and engagement. Terry, I want you to imagine that you're in a job, in which case you're having to do the repeated tasks day in and day out. And maybe that job has a really great educational program, and that's really thriving your drive to learn. And maybe that job has great resources and you're acquiring a lot of money. How do you think you would react in that type of a position?
In all sincerity, unless I was absolutely enamored with the people, I wouldn't have that job for very long. I know I wouldn't because of the fact that that repetitive task thing drives me bonkers, right? So I'm good with it if it's a short sprint, right? I can gut through anything for about 6 weeks. You put me in a situation where it's going to be 3 months, 6 months, a year. I'm, listen, I'm not suicidal by nature, so that's probably not it. But I am going to extricate myself from that situation, or, or, or be exceedingly complaining. I will complain and my sarcasm will kick up 87 notches. I'll be a bear to be around, and I would figure out how to get myself escorted out of the building without, getting escorted out of the building.
First job I was ever fired from, they were paying, this was, 24 years ago. I got fired on day two. It was a factory where I took a plastic pom pom and slid it into a plastic sleeve and set it on the conveyor belt. Took me exactly 2 days to get let go from there because I just couldn't handle it. But, I bring that up because one of the things that I always see in any of the organizations that I consult or any of the, and I'm assuming that you probably see this too, is like, right, our teams are disengaged, or our teams are or we're not getting the kind of productivity that we want. And a lot of times the first thing and the natural inclination is, okay, let's offer bonuses, let's do incentives, let's do this, let's do that. And those things are often really costly and ultimately don't end up driving up productivity at all, because I think in many of those cases organizations are not paying attention to all four of the drives and helping people to find balance. When we think about like leadership, a good leader is going to help a good business leader is going to help their teams acquire resources so they can pay their bills, they can have their status, they can eat. They're going to help them learn and develop and grow so they're better tomorrow than they were today. They're going to help them feel connected, the drive to bond. They're going to really help them connect with the people around them, connect with their teams, connect with their leadership, feel seen, valued, and heard. And they're going to help them defend, the drive to defend. They're going to help them feel stability and security and certainty. They're going to create psychological safety. So oftentimes we think it's always the acquire, let's just do bonuses and incentives. That's not going to motivate everybody. Uh, that's something that you really do need to think about is, how am I showing up as a leader or a business or an organization to help all of my teams fulfill all of the drives? Because I can pay you as much as I possibly could, Terry, but if I've got you pushing the button every single day, your motivation and engagement is going to go out the window. There's not enough money to keep elevating you, to keep that dopamine going for that type of a job. So I wanted to bring that around to that motivation and engagement. Really look into the drives. What is it that you're not filling, and what is it that you're overfilling? And is it consistent with what you have?
It's interesting that you bring that up, Jay, because I mentioned I was a past recruiter, and statistics show that something like 70% of people that accept a counteroffer to stay with their current company after they said they were going to leave end up leaving that position within 6 months. Because just because you throw more money at the problem, that doesn't address the actual cause of said problem. And so you absolutely nailed it. And there's real world examples and statistics that prove that out.
So I do want to take on, and this really fits in this conversation. Krissa asked the question, based on the results, are there career path recommendations that participants should consider? So I'm going to answer this kind of in two ways. One is we never use the elements to say you're going to be good at something or not good at something. For example, let's take sales. And a lot of people often say, all right, fire elements. So, that's the sales. They want to get out there, they want to win, they want to generate revenue, they want to get that money and acquire resources. So sales is a good fit. What we can tell you is, statistically speaking, across our data sets, yes, we do see a lot of fire elements as the primary element in sales. We do see a lot of water elements as the primary elements in teaching and in nursing and in social work. But just because you have a high element or a primary drive towards something doesn't mean that you're going to be good at it, or it doesn't mean that it's going to bring you satisfaction. I can teach somebody who is a water element to be one of your top salespeople. And the reason is because they're going to work towards relationship based sales. It may not be as direct, smile and dial and get out there and do that, but they're going to cultivate long term value for an organization by relationship building in that sales. Take an earth and let's set up a sales process or a systems approach to sales where you're going to be able to find the certainty and be able to analyze and deduce the data, right? So no element owns any particular industry, role, or trade. Does our data set suggest that people are attracted to positions that are more aligned with their elements? Yeah, absolutely. Keller Williams sales teams generally are somewhere in a range of about 60% of them show fire as their primary element. Water is the secondary. When we look at some of the other areas, engineering, manufacturing engineers tend to show very high earth and very high air, teetering off in between there with fire coming in as a second. So when you think about what is driving you, Krissa, and you ask the question of trying to figure out what your next career goal is, water and earth are at the bottom of the wheel, which means structure. You're going to want some stability, some consistency. You're going to want some of that team connection, but you're going to want to make sure that there are solid expectations. And that's something to ask your managers, like, how are you setting up expectations that I know that I'm going to be a valuable contributor to this position, to this job, or to this industry? And that's really where you're going to want to focus your energy and effort. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's an incredibly solid answer, and I love that. I and you said this numerous times about the idea that we don't really use behavioral elements for hiring or from employment purposes. Um, I'm wondering if that's just because there's a concern about the sample size, right? The number of actual inputs to the data, or is there a different reason for that?
Uh, in the sample, and I can give you some background, and this was actually something that we talked about at TEDx, right? Like when we think about what kind of motivates us, there are certain roles or certain industries that may be very much aligned with our drives. Like, say, for example, let's use a Wall Street trader. I don't see a Wall Street trader on here, right? Wall Street trader, we know that that is going to be high intensity, quick decisions, make the choice, get it out there, get it to market, and there's a big value proposition that comes with it. And when we have done some assessments with some different Wall Street traders, sure enough, we expect fire is going to show up, and sure enough, it shows up. When we do something like CEOs, I'll use this as an example. CEOs and executive teams tend to have a lot of fire in it. Why? Not because it necessarily makes them a good CEO, but a lot of times because they've jumped, they've taken action, they've gone out and got results in the first place, which got them probably promoted or visibility that moved them into that position. So there are some different industries, like for example, in healthcare, we've got more than 5,000 data sets. And what we see is about 72% of frontline nurses end up showing water as their primary element. Education, probably about the same amount. Frontline teachers, 78% tend up showing water as their primary element. However, their secondary elements are very different. In the healthcare industry, it's more earth. So dot the I's, cross the T's, keep yourself, make sure you're following systems and process. In education, we see a lot more air. driven to learn, driven to new experiences, coming up with new ideas. So, in even the largest data sets that we have, there is some relative consistency, but we do find fires that are frontline nurses. We do find earths that are frontline nurses. We do find airs that are frontline nurses. So the data is really interesting when you kind of parcel it out like that.
Have you ever mapped it to job satisfaction?
Interestingly, that is something that we are working on right now. So we are trying to find out, like, what is your level of, in any of the organizations that we've done a little bit of like culture pulse. So getting an idea of employee satisfaction, engagement, et cetera. And we have the data sets from many of those organizations. What we're trying to do now is use an AI model to be able to map those different things and how much they're leaning into their drives versus not leaning into their drives. So stay tuned.
Yeah, no, I love that because I can totally see, you have a fire as a nurse, uh, but that doesn't mean that they really want to be a nurse. That could have been something that their mom and dad said from the time they were little, you're going to be a nurse, right? That happens all the time. I think about, lawyers or dentists or people that have that family tradition of this is who we are and what we do. Or you hear professional athletes talk about, "I didn't even really wanna play football, man. I wanted to be a baseball player, but I just kept showing up and they kept promoting me, and next thing I know, I was making $800 million a second and, life's good." It's interesting.
Absolutely. I see a question from Taylor in there. Have you ever seen a pretty even, scoring across elements? So I can share with you, there's a magical number. That point four is like what we call the line of harmony. And if you magically did all of the questions in a perfect order, all different 80 potential and 20,000 different potential scenarios that you could come out, you could, in theory, get a point four across all. Never seen that. However, we have seen people that are very much in that line of balance. So let me real quick, I'll even just scroll up. The next screen in the assessment kind of shows where those lines of balance are. Notice that I, I am not balanced in any of the elements. That's how you know I didn't cheat the results. My team often reminds me you are very unbalanced, Jay. I think they have some fun with that. But when we see somebody that is inside of that balance zone, one of the things that we know is they usually can lean in and lean out. The drive is not over pulling them or over pushing them. They can really kind of adapt those behaviors as necessary. Whereas when somebody has a really strong drive, it's a little bit more difficult for them to behaviorally pull that back. Or a drive below, it's a little different, it's a little more difficult. They have to have more intentionality and more practice towards the awareness of activating those drives on a more regular basis. Doesn't mean they can't. It just means that more energy has to be put in to those particular drives than, say, somebody that has them in that balance zone. It's a great question, Taylor.
Let's go back if we can, because unless we're missing a question, I wanna make sure we get those done. And I think we're comfortable there. We had started talking about with it. We started this off with a poll, right? And some of the things that showed up was motivation. That was number one on the list. Number two on the list was dealing with difficult discussions.
Mm.
So I'd like you to take a swing at how do we use these drives to impact motivation for others? And I'll take a swing at how do we use these drives and these elements to deal with difficult discussions.
Yeah, so it's here's let me share with you kind of my personal space here. I am very much a fire element, as you saw in the assessments, with an air backing. I innovate, create new ideas, adapt to circumstances in order to drive results and to win. So that's kind of how I would categorize that. Now, that means that I make decisions very quickly. That means that oftentimes I am willing to take risks and chances. Let's say that my legal department has more of a earth and more of an earth and we'll call it water backing, more structured, more systems thinking, more let's think about the people. It would be very, very easy for me to demotivate that team by constantly changing direction. So I might say, hey, team, we're going north today. And they're going to be like, yeah, let's do it. And they're going to follow along and get in that vision. Well, next week when I come back and be like, hey, team, we're going south. And by the way, for anybody that does know me, yes, this is exactly what my behaviors have always been. And now I've really tried through this program to work. Thanks, Terry. Appreciate that. She's like, yes.
Let's put
So
a pin
that
in
is
it, Jay.
something, but that was a blind spot and a gap because for me, it was always just like, but this is a better idea and let's go with this rather than necessarily staying structured or focused on one particular direction and seeing that to the end. So I could have the impact of really demotivating somebody or constantly moving in different directions and making them feel like they're wasting their time, energy, or efforts planning one thing when I'm just going to change it the next week, anyways. That is one of the things that oftentimes, if we're not aware of our drives, those behaviors come out so naturally that I don't even think twice about it. Minimally, I've now started to think about how is this going to impact my team? What is this going to impact, somebody that's more structured? So when I present an idea, like I actually presented an idea to my executive team this morning, I said, here's the idea. This is what it looks like. This is what I'd like it to be structured on. This is where I think it fits for Q1 in the next quarter. I want you to take a little bit of time and poke holes in this because I haven't fully developed this thought. We'll talk about this next week as one of our first agenda items. Now I've given them a week to think about it. I've given them opportunity to really kind of invest and think through those different things. They're going to come back with way better responses. They're not going to feel put on the spot. They're not going to feel like, oh my gosh, here we go, another half-baked idea from Jay, and 3 weeks from now he's going to forget about this. We're going to actually have dialogue on that. So that's part of that motivation and engaging piece is I understand my elements and I understand my team's elements, which gives me an opportunity to say, how can we make sure that people are living into those drives more effectively? So I want to hear your comments on conversations and difficult behaviors here, Terry.
Well, and I want to tag on something you just said. It gives your team a week, but it also gives you that week too, right? To make sure that it is the right direction and the idea is worth actually ferreting out, and helps you think a little deeper on it as well.
Which sometimes can really be a big value proposition.
Right? I
Yep.
mean, it's true. Listen, and this is why the dealing with difficult conversations is so useful because if you understand how people think and how they're likely to behave, it almost becomes predictable how they're going to react or respond to a situation. So when we're communicating with folks, especially when and there's not really opposites. It's easy to say that air is the opposite of earth and water is the opposite of fire. But those drivers are, they're not polar opposite by any sense of the imagination. So, if you're speaking to a fire person and an earth person is having that conversation, the earth person's gonna want to know detail after detail, dates, all the information. Whereas the fire person's going to want just the high level facts as quickly as humanly possible. So you can see instantly that there's going to be some level of conflict in that communication because the way they want information is so different. So using a tool like this to understand how people want to process or deliver information becomes incredibly valuable because we do it differently. And if you can figure out how to move past their primary element and speak to that secondary element, that can be really helpful. I was thinking about it earlier in the year before I met Jay, and my initial thought was if you're dealing with someone who's fire, and at the time I knew like fire was the one I had pretty much bang on in my initial assessment. I knew that they wanted information short and they wanted it now and they didn't want all the details. And I knew that they could snap out easily. Fire people are fiery, right? And to me, there was two ways to deal with fire. The idea one was you can just be cool and calm and collected and kind of have that flow that I believe that water might have. Um, but that can lead to two different results, right? That can actually if someone's yelling and screaming at you and you start talking in a lower, softer, calmer voice, that's either going to bring them down or it's going to fire them up even more. And the other option was to outfire them, which can be easy if you have that in your element and in your makeup, but it can be really, really difficult if you're more on the timid side. You're not going to get toe to toe with someone. What do you think about that, Jay?
You know, it's interesting. Like, uh, this is where I say test behaviors. So if I'm say working with you, and at some point in time, you we can be so aware when we want to be. If you want to resolve a conflict, it's one of those where we kind of have to absorb our own ego sometimes and go, all right, in this interaction, I know in this board meeting, Terry is gonna since you're not a fire, I'll say Terry's going to go over fire on me and he's going to be super direct and he's going to be angry. How do I manage that? In this case, I'm going to try to calm the tension down. I'm going to try to be diplomatic. I'm going to slow my voice down, my tone down, and I'm going to try to utilize a lower term. And then I'm going to measure Terry's response or reaction to that. Does Terry feel like I am being that I'm placating him? Does he feel like I'm being demeaning? Does he this, that, the other thing? And when I see that, that is behavioral testing. Okay, that didn't work. What's my next behavior? Because if I keep repeating the same behavior over and over again, it's the definition of insanity. Did my reaction, did my reaction generate the result that I wanted? If it didn't, what is my next behavioral strategy? Did that generate the reaction that I wanted? No. What is my next behavioral strategy? But being able to identify that Terry's a fire, I know that he's going to want to win. Terry, you know what? It seems like you're really passionate about this. I think that if we do this together, we're going to be able to take on the world. And now all of a sudden, I'm going to shift my communication to be more aligned with what you actually want to get. And that's usually where I'm going to find some of those more effective communications. But Terry, here we are, we're at the 1 o'clock hour, and I want to make sure that we're thoughtful of our participants. I see that we've gotten through most of the questions here. Any last words that you want to share with our people in this lunch and learn?
I just want to brag about you and say what a great job you did. I thought this was excellent, and I'm excited to have been a part of it, man. I do like the tools. I like the assessment. I like the people that are a part of it, and yeah, I'm really anxious and looking forward to moving forward, my man. So thank you all for being here. I appreciate the questions, the thought out responses, and all that. And we're here to support you in any way you need.
I thank you so much for being here, Terry. I love having these conversations with you and actually having it with, a live studio audience this time. I always learn from you, and it's really, really invigorating. I always leave with so much energy. So thank you for being here. Thank you for being a big part of the program. And for all of you that attended, thank you so much for joining us. This is probably not going to be the last. We hope that you enjoyed it. We would love any feedback that you're able to give us. If there's an opportunity for you to reach out to Terry on LinkedIn, like I said, excellent coach, excellent. If you've ever thought about a TEDx, now is the time. Do it, jump in there. If you've ever thought about, hey, I really need some help in my whatever it is from your business, reach out to Terry. He's an incredible, incredible coach. But happy to have you all here. Hope you enjoyed, and we look forward to seeing you in the next webinar or Lunch and Learn series. So thanks, everyone.
Mergenetics. I don't know yet.
I've heard of that one. So that one is one that I've heard of Emergenetics, but I don't know it too deeply. So Chrissy, if you've got any information on that, you can send that to me. I would love to learn a little bit more about that.